Hi guys, I'm going to recap and cover with this lesson Consumer Affairs, so CAV, so Consumer Affairs Victoria, which I will refer to as CAV, and of course in particular the focus of the purposes and the appropriateness of Consumer Affairs Victoria. So I should also point out before I get into Consumer Affairs or CAV, the difference between what a court is and say what the role of Consumer Affairs and VCAT is. So courts are a judicial body, so obviously judges work in courts, and courts focus on deciding facts and the law. So in our constitution under chapter 3, it says that a judiciary must be established and it must be independent. So that's the separation of powers. So we've got our judiciary, our legislature, and of course the executive. We also have a range of what's called non-judicial bodies, but they still resolve disputes. So they offer assistance with parties, so this is civil cases of course, with the resolution of any of their disputes. The biggest issue with courts is obviously they are very timely and they are very costly. So anyone who wants to resolve their disputes, who wants to use courts, they cost a lot of money, they take a lot of time, and they are complex. So you're going to need to have, hire a lawyer, and that also adds to your cost. So a non-judicial body do not operate, as part of the judiciary. They do resolve disputes like courts, but they are not a judiciary. They're not in that separation of powers. So the study design says that we need to know about CAV and VCAT I'll cover in the next lesson. And you need to know when it's appropriate to use these bodies. So going back to that appropriateness we've discussed previously. So Consumer Affairs Victoria only operates in Victoria, obviously. It is a government body. It is part of the business unit of the Victorian Department of Justice, and it is a complaints body. So it has other roles than just resolving disputes, and we'll get into that in a moment. So those who don't know or unaware, a consumer is someone who uses or consumes goods and services. So that is their main function, but they do focus in other areas as well. Some of their role obviously is to educate consumers. So if you go to their website, they will talk about the rights of a consumer and of course of a trader, so someone who sells, businesses as well, particularly when it comes to consumer protection. So they deal with different legislation. So one of the other roles they do besides resolving disputes is they investigate. So they have investigatory powers, complaints on behalf of consumers, particularly if there's one business that has been, trading unfairly or false advertising or, scheming consumers. So they can take legal action and investigate complaints. They conciliate disputes between consumers and traders, and tenants and landlords. They can take enforcement action, so even after they can investigate, and one of the things they can also do is take enforcement action. So they can actually take a case to the courts against a trader or a landlord when they breach consumer protection legislation without costs to the injured parties. So if I have a dispute with another party, particularly if I'm a tenant or a landlord or a consumer or a trader, and I want to go to the Consumer Affairs Victoria, what kind of methods do they use? They use conciliation. So we'll go into conciliation in a little bit more detail, but you all should know what conciliation is from last year. If not, it is a method of dispute resolution. So it has nothing to do with a courtroom or a trial. So in conciliation, we have an independent third party known as a conciliator, and they will help the disputing parties reach a resolution. So remember, in conciliation, the independent third party does not make the decision for the parties. So the conciliator here, one of the things they can do is to try and facilitate discussion. So they try and facilitate discussion between, between the two parties. The conciliator can also provide suggestions and options to the two parties as well. However, they cannot make the decision for the two parties. They must come to the decision on their own, and the decision they make is not legally binding. However, you see at this last dot point here. A decision reached can be binding if a document known as a terms of settlement or terms of agreement is agreed upon and signed, so it is a contract. So one of the other roles they can have is compliance. So compliance means adherence or to follow through. CAV has its own compliance powers and can impose a range of monetary penalties, so fines, and take its own legal action on behalf of a consumer or consumers who have suffered a loss. So if I had to look at consumer affairs and break it down and their purposes, I'll do this here. Apologies for the handwriting, but Consumer Affairs Victoria is a complaints body. That is a government agency that provides information and dispute resolution services. So some of its characteristic is it provides free conciliation. I should put this here. So their services for conciliation between two parties is free, although one of the downsides is Consumer Affairs does not have the power to compel parties to undertake conciliation. It can investigate issues, particularly between tenants and landlords, and consumers and traders. It can enforce compliance against a trader or a landlord, and it can also commence proceedings on behalf of consumers. So it can take legal action. So under examples, I've put the jurisdiction of Consumer Affairs. So these are the cases or issues they can hear. Tenants and landlords, the disputes between someone who's renting a property and the owner of the property as well. In the commission of purchasing goods and services between a consumer and a trader, so a business owner. Retirement villages, any issues with retirement villages, and owners corporation. So owners corporation is to do with, it's also called a body corporate, so it's deal with someone who manages common property. So it could be multiple rental properties, so a block of flats or a group of townhouses. It could be commercial buildings, so a row of shops, a shopping centre, etc. So for non-examples, Consumer Affairs does not deal with complex matters, so for instance representative proceedings, and they're not very good for parties who are not willing to, talk it out and negotiate because they offer conciliation. They don't have any appeals, so you can't appeal any matter, and the decision is final, and they don't have juries, so no trials, etc. Alright, so appropriateness of CAV. So if you get a question asking, when is Consumer Affairs appropriate, or a case study, these are the things that you need to look at. So is it within the jurisdiction? So we've looked at, the provision of goods and services, the consumer and the trader. Is it to do with a residential tenancy, the landlord and the tenant? Is it to do with retirement villages or owners corporation? So it must be here. This is their jurisdiction, the power to hear. Legislation has empowered them to hear these cases. Also, you need to look at what's the likelihood of that case will settle. Will depend on how delayed, the delay in receiving the complaint. So what is the time frame? So going back to that, limitations as well. Have there been any other cases involving the other party? So this is when Consumer Affairs might investigate or use their compliance powers, particularly if it's one trader or one business that has had issues with multiple consumers or multiple disputes with other parties. Have they made any attempts at negotiating? It's very important. You have to try and negotiate with the disputing party before you go to Consumer Affairs. You can't go to Consumer Affairs right away. Or if there's been a settlement that's been offered. So if you have an issue with, say, your landlord or a business and they've given you an offer or tried to settle it and you've said no, Consumer Affairs generally do not take on this case. It's not appropriate for conciliation. Are there other ways? So, like I said, negotiate first off. You have to negotiate. It's very important, the first step. Because the dispute could be resolved by just you simply calling up, your landlord to try and resolve the dispute. Perhaps court might be better, particularly if it is a more complex matter, or a tribunal, particularly if it's going to be hard to get them to try and negotiate or try to resolve the disputes and they're not willing to come to the table. So these are the questions you must ask yourself when you get a question about appropriateness. Is it within the jurisdiction of Consumer Affairs? So it has to be those 4 types of disputes. So to do with residential tenancies, the sales of goods and services, owners corporation or body corporate, and retirement village. And also, consumer affairs may not be the best place to resolve the dispute, particularly if that party is not willing to negotiate. So if they're not willing to negotiate or conciliate, then CAV is not going to help. And is there another way or better way to resolve that dispute? So going to court or going to VCAT. So consumer affairs is limited in assisting the settlement of disputes that are within its jurisdiction. It obtains its power through different Victorian legislation. So true or false, can the ones below be heard by consumer affairs? So true or false, the supply of goods and services, can CAV settle those types of dispute? Yes, true. Can they hear civil appeals? No, false. It has to be heard through a court. Can they hear disputes about residential tenancies? Yes, true. Can they hear disputes about retirement villages? Yes, true. Can they hear disputes about contracts? So unless that contract is to do with, say, tenancy agreement, no. So contract law is slightly different. Owners corporations or body corporates? Yes, true. Car accidents? No, false. So strengths and weaknesses of consumer affairs. So obviously conciliation, being free, is a great strength. It's accessible to all Victorians. However, CAV cannot compel parties to participate in conciliation or participate in a positive manner. So even if they do participate, doesn't mean they're actually going to be positive or want to come to an agreement. They will try and make sure the process is fair and for both parties have equal opportunity to present their case. That comes down to the method of dispute, which is conciliation. Consumer affairs can intervene in certain disputes, but has no power in assisting resolving disputes in other areas. So if there's one landlord and multiple tenants wanting to take legal action because the landlord is doing illegal action or operating outside their tenancy agreement. The good thing about CAV is it is informal and it resolves in a timely manner, so it's quick. So if you want your dispute to be resolved very quickly, consumer affairs is great. It is appropriate. They don't deal with large or complex disputes, so no representative proceedings. The agreement reached at CAD, conciliation is made by the parties, so it generally should be accepted by both parties, particularly if a terms of settlement has been signed. It will be legally binding. If that's not been signed, it's not legally binding. And it also is, there is no appeals either, so the decision is final. I think you can only appeal on point of law. So any decision made in conciliation needs to be enforced through the courts. So if the party who owes you money is not paying it or hasn't finished off or finalised a contract to do with, say, the sales of goods and services or a residential tenancy contract, it has to be enforced through the courts. So with Consumer Affairs Victoria, to sum it up, make sure you know the jurisdiction, the 4 areas of dispute it can hear. So in the sales of goods and services between consumer and a trader, landlord and a tenant, retirement villages and owners corporation. Remember, their purpose is to help parties resolve disputes using conciliation. It can also offer education to the public as well as investigate or enforce compliance against a trader or a landlord. And then it's appropriateness. So when you get a question about appropriateness, you generally get a case study and it'll ask you in this case study, is this case appropriate or not appropriate? So read through it, make sure that the jurisdiction is met, things like time, can they actually resolve the dispute on their own, etc. So thank you guys. Have any questions, just email me.